Hello you lovely lot and welcome to a brand new video. My name is Katie and I'm going to be continuing exploring the different kinds of gouache I've got in at the moment. In the last video, if you haven't watched it already, I explore the Holbein Gouache 18 set. Unfortunately, I don't have a price because they were gifted to me by my husband. However, they are eye-wateringly expensive. So in contrast to that, I thought I would go on the other end of the price spectrum there and use some really cheap ones I picked up about 3, maybe 4 years ago. These are the Royal and Langnickel Artist Paint Gouache 6 set. And they were priced at £3.99 at the time, but that particular art shop was closing down and I think there was a massive discount on it, so it probably cost me even less than that. We have just six colours to work with. We have lemon yellow, Prussian blue, viridian, crimson red lake, lamp black and titanium white. And they come in 21ml tubes. So, in contrast to the Holbein, pretty generous amount per tube there. Upon swatching them, I did notice the consistency to be a little bit thicker, I guess. However, when it was watered down, it was at the cost of the opacity. So luckily, with having plenty to go at there, I didn't really need to add much water, and I guess the sweet spot was relatively easy to find. Of course, I am keeping with the theme of dragons here because you know we like a good old gouache dragon on this channel. And I thought this particular dragon, I guess in keeping with the star theme I've got going on, is a falling star. Now I am going to create a brand new playlist for exploring all of these gouaches I've got, just to make it easier for you guys to, I guess, refer to. And as well, I suppose it's going to be helpful for me to refer to as well for future projects. The paper I'm using again is the Frisk watercolour paper, and I have been using that since the start of this series, I guess. And I'll continue to use that until it runs out, and then I'll probably start using the St Cuthbert's Mill Botanical because it's a similar texture and I do like these kinds of surfaces to paint on. But with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about this paint. I wanted quite a deep dark background, and the Prussian blue mixed with a smidgen of the lamp black achieved the colour I wanted there. I didn't add a lot of water to the colour mixture because it did sort of impact the opacity of the actual layers that I was putting down. And I wanted everything to be as flat as possible without too much of the paper coming through, like you'd get with a watercolour, I guess. I mixed a very light lilac using a bit of the crimson red and again a smidgen of Prussian blue with a good dollop of that titanium white there, and I was quite happy with the opacity level there. I did find though, because I'm not adding quite as much water to it, that I did have to keep dipping in and out of the palette quite frequently. But hey, you know what? These cost me, let's just say £3.99. I'm not expecting a lot from them. However, I'm quite surprised by how they performed. Now, pigment information aside, these paints are actually quite nice to paint with. They are a nice experience. Okay, I have to use them a little bit thicker, otherwise, as I've mentioned, the opacity goes. But when it's laid down on the paper, I was pretty impressed. As gouache, in my understanding anyway, has been mainly used for illustrations that are going to be mass-produced, the light fastness, for me personally, isn't a massive issue. For example, if I was going to get prints made of these, and of course I am still looking into making prints of things, so if you are enjoying this series, let me know if you'd like to see them in print form. But yes, it doesn't massively matter if it's light fast or not if you're creating art for the intention of just making prints. I personally wouldn't recommend these paints to use for a piece of art you would hang on the wall because it's gonna fade. But as far as a pleasant painting experience is concerned, yeah, these are good. And if you're wanting a little bit of a trial of gouache, if you've never used it before, I don't think these are necessarily a bad set to start off with. The area I'm painting now on the dragon's body did end up being a little bit patchy. However, I'd have obviously had a little break between painting the background and working a little bit more on the foreground there. And the paint that I'd poured in the palette had somewhat dried. So I thought, let's see how well this comes back to life. Now obviously my water ratio to dried paint ratio was a little off there, and I think that's why it's just a smidge streaky there. However, it's not massively noticeable at the same time. I think it's just because I'm sitting over my work and watching it dry in front of me, and I can see where it's a little bit patchy. But you know how it works when I'm doing these dragons. I'm going to hide a lot of those little imperfections with some scale detail, so it's not a massive issue at this particular point. However, if you were wanting to just do large flat areas without any texture, I don't recommend using a dried version. This would not pour well into pans. Of course, I completely forgot to mention talking about the white paint. So it's a little darker than the actual paper I'm working on, at least when it's dried. However, on the sky background I've done there, it showed up pretty well. It didn't bring anything beneath it back to life, which is always a massive plus for me. And as well, the white was actually pretty good to mix up colours with, providing it came straight from the tube and not from some dried up blob of it that had been left for 24 hours. So that's the main takeaway I can give you with this. I wanted this dragon to have quite cool colours, and I just wanted to introduce a little bit of green in there as well as some blues. The Viridian mixed with some lemon yellow and obviously a lot of white there worked really well. And again, once I'd done each layer, I'd just adjust the mixture there by either adding a little more blue, a little more of the Viridian, or a little more of the lemon yellow. Now, once I'd figured out the best consistency to work with these paints, I did find that compared to the other gouaches that I've used recently, yes, you do kind of have to keep it relatively thick. For the background, it was quite a thick layer, so I do recommend you use the right brush for the job. You don't want to have to keep dipping in and out all the time. And as well, if you use a larger brush, hopefully you'll get a more consistent layer for those larger areas. For the fine details and the scales and the highlights and the stars in the background, definitely use a thin brush, but bear in mind you are going to have to dip in and out because that paint is thick. I did find one or two areas where I had watered the paint down perhaps a little bit too much. It did slightly reactivate the paint that was next to it, so that is also worth bearing in mind. However, once everything had dried off and just making some adjustments to the consistency of the paint, it was easily rectified by just going over it in another layer, which is the beauty of gouache. When it comes to adding your line details in there, just bear in mind again, you're going to have to make sure there is an adequate amount of paint on the brush, otherwise you're going to end up with a slight dry brush effect there, which is fine if you want it, but that doesn't really suit the style of the work I'm going for. But again, just bear that in mind. Gouache dries pretty quickly in my opinion, and I tend to find with this especially, when doing those line areas, it dries on the brush to a point where it's not easy to paint with, so just make sure that you've got enough paint on the brush that's still wet. As I mentioned earlier, I've had these paints for a while now. I think I opened them, I squeezed them out, and at the time I wasn't impressed with them because I just didn't have that much experience or knowledge using this paint. However, for this particular project and video, I was pleasantly surprised by how different they felt compared to my first impression. Some of them, again, had already been opened and others hadn't. but that didn't seem to affect the actual mixture all that much. I do tend to find when I'm using any paints from a tube, there is going to be some separation there just because of how they've been sat. However, I didn't quite notice it so much with this, unless there's like a big blob of it pooled at the back of the tube, which I thought that'll be a nice surprise later. I didn't get any of that horrible binder ooze that sometimes does happen. I didn't get much of it anyway. I added a slightly paler, I didn't think I could get that colour any paler, but I did. I added a slightly paler version of the dragon's body to the dragon's wings, and I thought by introducing a, I guess, muted pastel blue, I mean, is that even a thing? But I thought that particular colour I'd mixed for the outline was just perfect to just introduce some of those cooler colours in there. So I chose these colours because, well, falling stars, I guess, are meteorites and they're big chunks of ice and rock. So I thought those cooler colours would be, I guess, a nice contrast to the warmer colours I'd used on the last picture. The stars in the background, I guess, kind of look a little bit like snow, but you know what, with it being a big block of ice anyway, let's just say it's a combination of stars and shavings off of ice from the meteorite there. To introduce a little bit more tone and definition on the dragon as well, I take that lime colour and just add a few extra scales just to add a bit more of that form that's needed, and also it really made those eyes stand out a lot better too. So in conclusion, for $3.99 these paints are fantastic. Okay, they're not quite as vibrant as the previous two sets that I've used, but I kind of expected that. For a painting where I didn't want loads of wacky, bold, vibrant colours and I just wanted something to be a little more subtle, I guess. But these worked out fine. You've got your primaries there, you've got a random green colour in there for whatever reason, but I guess when you've got your primaries, a black and a white, you can pretty much mix up any colour that you want. And also, there's something to be said about buying a smaller set to begin with. If you are a beginner and you're learning colour theory and mixing colours and what ratios to use and just exploring mediums like this in general, I think this is a pretty good beginner's set. I do recommend just playing about as well with water to paint ratios and seeing which works best for you. On the package of these paints, it does say you can use it as a wet and wet technique, similar to watercolours. However, that's just not my vibe when I'm using these paints. I kind of think I might as well just use a watercolour if I want a watercolour effect. But hey, if it says you can do that, give it a try. Yes, there is a little bit more hard work involved when using cheaper supplies, and that is a fact. However, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing again. It's just learning to familiarise yourself with a medium, and if you do like it, that's great, you haven't spent a lot and you can perhaps invest in better sets. However, if you don't like it, it's not a huge dent to the pocket. I'm super pleased with how this came out and the experience overall. Of course, let me know down below what you think of this. And for the next video, do you want me to use a restrictive set or one of the sets with quite a few more colours in? Let me know and see if I can make that happen. In the meantime, I'll leave the last gouache video on the screen along with the playlist that all of these are going to be in, so by all means, have a good watch. Of course, thank you as always for watching, and I do hope you've enjoyed this one. And I look forward to making another one. Anyway, I'll see you lovely lots soon. Bye!